right, thank you, everyone. So my name's Sarah Carkner, Manager of Long-Term Assessments at the NYISO, and today I'll be talking through our recent experience using PLEXOS LT to evaluate New York's evolving electric system. So here, just for reference, we have some specs on the New York ISO to put it into perspective for folks. We're one of 9 ISO RTOs in North America. We are a single state ISO, and compared to others, we are much smaller, but just some metrics here on our annual energy and size of the company. So today I'll be talking through New York State policy mandates and what that means for our planning studies and what's going on in New York. Provide a brief overview of NYISO's System and Resource Planning Department, and then talk through some use cases where we've been using PLEXOS LT in the last few years. And then I'll end it with some key insights and talk about next steps and what we're looking forward to with PLEXOS. So for those that may not know, New York State has some of the most ambitious policies and legislations aimed at completely decarbonizing the electricity sector. And in fact, in 2019, New York State signed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act into law, which mandates specific integration of renewable resources and clean energy mandates to decarbonize the grid. And we'll go into that a bit more on the following slides. As the independent system operator, NYISO plays a key role in conducting studies and supplying information associated with the achievement of these policies to our stakeholders, which includes market participants, state agencies, policymakers, and others. So we conduct extensive studies and analyses on a routine basis to constantly evaluate the evolving grid, update our assumptions, and continue to inform on what's going on. So on this slide here, I'm showing many of the energy policy mandates that are prescribed in the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. So as I mentioned before, these are all prescribed and are now state law in New York. So there's specific targets for integration of specific technologies, such as distributed solar, battery storage, and offshore wind by certain years. And then additionally, we have these overarching mandates such as 70% renewable energy in the grid by 2030 and 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040. So 2040 and beyond, state law tells us that we cannot have any carbon emissions in the electric sector. So what are we doing about that? So in the System and Resource Planning Department at NYISO, we have many different functions, many different groups that work on different things, and here are some of the major items that we're tasked with in planning. We comprehensively plan for the system. We reliably interconnect generation, load, and transmission. We forecast both in the short and long term, so day-ahead forecasting all the way out to 30 years, and how the demand on the system is going to evolve, what does electrification look like, and otherwise. And ultimately, we independently provide information to our stakeholders. So what I'm showing here is an overview of our comprehensive system planning process. This is a 2-year cycle at the NYISO where we go through various studies on the reliability side and economic planning side, demand forecasting. So I won't go into this in too much detail, but really what I wanted to highlight is that currently there are 2 areas of NYISO's comprehensive system planning process where we leverage PLEXOS for capacity expansion. And that is in our economic planning process, to ultimately identify transmission expansion opportunities, and also in our public policy transmission planning process. And so I'll talk about these a little bit more. So in the last few years, NYISO has developed and ultimately used PLEXOS LT for capacity expansion modeling in our long-term planning studies. Study cycle now using capacity expansion, and excited to see where this will go going forward. At this point, the primary use for our capacity expansion model is to evaluate the system's evolution for full policy achievement. So we put in those policy constraints and see what the resource mix could be to fulfill that, and then inform through our various studies. Some recent planning studies that have leveraged this model include the System and Resource Outlook, which ultimately uses the capacity expansion model to identify potential resource mixes and identify challenges associated with the accelerated adoption of renewables, as well as our public policy transmission needs evaluation, where we've used capacity expansion modeling to evaluate economic benefits of proposed transmission projects. Integrating capacity expansion modeling into our planning processes has enabled the NYISO to evaluate various future system conditions. We look out a 20-year period and provide insights on many different questions. So just some of the questions that we're able to answer with capacity expansion modeling are: what type of generation should be built? How much? When should that generation be built? What are the primary drivers for the projected resource mix? What influences certain types of resources being built? And what are the potential costs associated with that and with full decarbonization of New York's grid? Answering these questions and understanding the potential impacts helps us to identify challenges on the system and inform of what could be going on in the longer term as we have this accelerated adoption of renewables and other clean emitting technologies. So just to level set for folks what our capacity expansion model really looks like. So some of our major assumptions are that we currently assume a pipe and bubble system topology. This is both for the New York region and for our neighboring regions. So we have a zonal pipe and bubble model for New York, and then kind of bubbles for our neighbors as well. We do custom methodology for time representation. We assess various different energy demand and peak forecasts. We know this is a major driver of what the resulting resource mix could look like. Other major assumptions are: what are the candidate technologies that we allow for expansion? And in New York, given what the CLCPA mandates are, the candidate technologies are limited to renewables, battery storage, and dispatchable emission-free resources. We do not currently presume that gas units or traditional fossil could still be built in New York. The costs associated with those candidate technologies is also a key assumption. We implement the policy constraints to align with the CLCPA mandates. And then we also assume planning reserve margins for our statewide and locational specific requirements for capacity, and have maximum resource potentials implemented as well to reflect real life constraints on land availability and other factors that could limit the amount of resources built. So in the model, we highly leverage custom constraints, particularly for our policy mandates. We implement the CLCPA mandates primarily using the installed capacity coefficient and generation coefficient constraints. We use the technology-specific constraints such as 9 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2035 using the installed capacity coefficient as a minimum bound on the amount of offshore wind on the state. We do that for the other technology-specific constraints as well. And then we use the generation coefficient to simulate the overarching policy mandates, such as a minimum of 70% renewable generation by 2030 and 100% emission-free grid by 2040 and beyond. So the first use case that I'll talk through is our System and Resource Outlook study. For this study, we primarily use capacity expansion modeling to project resource mixes to satisfy full achievement of the policy mandates through scenario analysis. And the key questions that we're able to get answers for are: what types of generation should be built, how much of that, where should the generation be located in the state, and when should that generation be built. These resource mixes are then further analyzed in production cost simulation to identify transmission investment opportunities, as well as other challenges associated with an accelerated adoption of clean emitting technologies. So on the right, the figure there shows the installed capacity projections for year 2040 for 5 different scenarios that we've assessed through our System and Resource Outlook process. You can see that there's significant amount of renewable capacity on the system to comply with the policy mandates. And that purple and white bar is what we call a DEFR, or dispatchable emission-free resource. In its nature, this is intended to be a proxy technology or maybe multiple technologies that fits the need of dispatchability, flexibility, and being emission-free. So given compliance with the CLCPA, presumably we can't run fossil units anymore, so we can see through the study results that a significant amount of defer capacity would be needed to support the high renewable penetration system. And just compared to some other ISOs, 100 gigawatts may not seem like a lot of capacity, but this is about 3 times the amount of capacity that's currently on the system in New York. So what we're seeing from our studies is that, in the next 15 years or so, the amount of capacity would not only have to triple, but it would have to be, renewable and dispatchable emission-free resources. And then another study that we've used capacity expansion modeling for is our public policy transmission needs evaluation. In this study, we used capacity expansion modeling to evaluate economic benefits of proposed transmission projects. And through this analysis, the key question was really, what is the total cost associated with achievement of, full achievement of the policies in the long term after a proposed transmission solution is modeled? So on the right, I'm showing examples of 7 different transmission projects that we evaluated. And ultimately what we did in this evaluation was we were able to quantify the amount of offshore wind curtailment reduction from a proposed transmission solution. So another way to say that would be is after the transmission solution is online, you're able to export more offshore wind and deliver more offshore wind in the state. By using this metric, we were then able to feed that into the capacity expansion model and see what the change in resource mix was. And that ultimately resulted in capital cost savings because you don't need to build as many other renewable resources now that you're able to get more energy from the offshore wind because of a transmission project. So that is how we used it in the public policy transmission needs evaluation last year for comparative purposes. And you can see in the graph on the bottom that overall there was a significant amount of less renewable capacity that was needed after a transmission project was modeled. So some key insights that we've learned from our study work is that policy mandates are driving the need for unprecedented levels of investment in new generation on the system. Dispatchable emission-free resources must be developed and ultimately deployed to help ensure reliability, provide firm capacity, and meet climate mandates with such high renewable penetration that would be needed on the system. And capacity expansion modeling is really helpful in providing insights to many of these key questions on what that future mix could look like, and really helping us to inform on potential challenges that could come along with that. So certainly answering some questions always leads to more new questions too. So some of the questions that we're trying to answer now are what technologies can fit the need of a dispatchable emission-free resource? What challenges may exist on the transmission system with high renewable penetration? How does new transmission impact projected resource mix? And how does demand impact projected generation mix? Similar to other areas, we're also projecting a really high increase of electrification, EVs, and other factors that are significantly increasing our demand in the longer term, which will ultimately result in even more generation required on the system. So we're always looking to continue developing and enhancing our models, and we'll continue to do so in future economic planning studies at the NYISO. Some recent model updates that we've been able to incorporate into our capacity expansion model include the inclusion of our neighboring systems, adoption of sampled chronology for our time representation in the capacity expansion model, improved battery storage modeling, calculation of marginal ELCC curves for renewable technologies and battery storage, and the addition of generation supply cost curves for renewable technologies to reflect the fact that after a certain amount of resources are built, that the costs get even higher, you have to build further out, and other factors. And going forward, some of our next steps are completing the next System and Resource Outlook study. We anticipate wrapping that up later this year. And we will also consider use of capacity expansion modeling in other areas of our system and resource planning group. And lastly, we will also be evaluating PLEXOS for other analyses. We've been using PLEXOS LT for a few years now, so I think the natural next question is exploring ST and or MT and PLEXOS as well. All right, thank you. Any questions?
Is this on? Yeah. Josh Farnsworth from Xcelerate. Just curious, like your heavy use of renewables in the future, have you been able to assess against like the availability of land that's suitable for use for those purposes? And do you have enough to even meet the need?
Yeah, that's a great question. So outside of the NYISO, some other studies have been done to assess what that, maximum potential is by area and, how much land there is, how much offshore wind availability there is. And we have leveraged those studies and used it as inputs into our capacity expansion model so that we know there's some kind of constraint. We can leverage other studies that have done more analysis on this. So we typically find that after imposing those, that some resources do hit those maximum limits. So without that, there would build even more. So it's good that we have those in there to reflect those real life constraints.
Daniel from RWE. Could you comment or elaborate a bit on the methodology that you use for calculating the ELCC, the marginal ELCC for the different resources, and if you use PLEXOS for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. The current method that we're using is calculated outside of PLEXOS, and we base it on what the projected resource mix is by type. So basically, we run the capacity expansion model first, see what the resulting mix could look like, and then do an offline calculation using net load for the resources, and then feed that back in as an input into the capacity expansion model. I do understand that there's capabilities in PLEXOS to do it directly within there, but we just haven't gotten there yet to integrating it directly within there. Great question.
Hi, Rob from the NYISO. Apologies if I missed this, but you mentioned that your generation portfolio is going to need to increase approximately by a factor of 3. How much is the demand increasing over that same period?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I'll just show this one for reference. So yeah, this is what I was referring to. The demand is absolutely increasing and ultimately driving this. And then additional resources are needed in the longer term to help with the decarbonized grid because of there's such high renewable penetration. I don't have a good number offhand. I don't know if the load doubles per se, but it's definitely much larger than what we're seeing now when we look out 2040 and beyond. So it is one of the major drivers in these resulting resource mixes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi there, John Cook from Salt River Project. What sort of assumptions are you making about when those dispatchable emissions-free resources are available?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the stance that we've taken is in our capacity expansion model, we really don't put too many limitations on the dispatchable emission-free resources. We do inform their costs based on technologies that we think could fit the need of a DFR, but in terms of their flexibility and their firm capacity, we don't really constrain it there. And then when we get to our production cost simulation, which is the next step after capacity expansion, we really dig in deep on what the DFR units are doing, and then our hope is to really define, how often are they running, how flexible are they, and kind of look at it from the operational characteristics there. So I guess in short, we don't really limit them to, certain flexibility or otherwise.
Okay, and in terms of being candidate resources, the assumption is that they're available starting today?
No, that's a great question. I think we currently have them as like 2031 would be the first year possible, and that's a fairly short time frame. But yeah, I think we delay it like almost 10 years
Okay, thanks.
in our 20-year study period. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, this is Amy from NYISO. You mentioned a model upgrade being the implementation of the generator supply cost curve. Is those calculations you guys do in-house, or is that coming from an outside source?
Yeah, thank you. That also came from an outside source. There was a study that was completed last year specific to New York that informed on, actually it had the maximum resource limitation by area and also costs and the cost curve. So we leveraged that work for use in our studies.
Maybe just one sort of follow-up to what I asked before. For your long-term plan, do you typically use for the reserve margins, constraints, or requirement, do you use just the plain one value reserve requirement or reliability requirement, or do you try to use New York's capacity demand function into the LT?
Yeah, that's a really good question and something that we've really considered, what's the best approach for that. Ultimately, what we've done is used a single value for that, but we use the UCAP equivalent of our requirements because it's, arguably more stable through time. It's not perfect. It should probably change more than that, but that's a simplifying assumption that we've made. All right, thank you, everyone.